So in this chapter, we're going to continue on with looking at our earliest ancestors, but now we're going to shift from the pre-Australopithecines into the Australopithecines. So there will be two different variations or forms that we will talk about today. There are the robust forms and the gracile forms. And I'll explain what that means here in a moment, but just to give us a time frame. So when we were talking about the pre-Australopithecines, so those that came before, so pre just means before. So the three species we talked about last class meeting was Salanthropus chigensis, or Tumai is the nickname, Salanthropus chigensis or Tumai, Ardipithecus rhomidus, or nickname Ardi, and then Orion tuganensis. Okay, so those are the three species that we consider the pre-Australopithecines that existed approximately 6 million years ago to 4 million years ago. Yes, Michaela. Did you have a question, Michaela? Okay, maybe it was an accidental hand raise. No worries. All right, so the Australopithecines are existing from 4 million years ago to as recently as 1 million years ago. Some of them were still hanging around. The robust forms actually were still hanging around as recently, possibly as 1 million years ago. So overall, even though they're now extinct, pretty successful species. They were around, or pretty successful group of species, I should say. They were around 3 million years, so that would have encompassed the early Pliocene to the early Pleistocene. All of these species are considered part-time or habitual bipeds. So thinking back to what we learned last class period, this is a combination of bipedal locomotion and arboreal climbing. So when you look at the postcranial skeletons, remember cranial is the head, postcranial is from the neck down. When you look at the postcranial from the neck down, you see a lot of features, a lot of mosaic features like longer arms, curved phalanges, mosaic pelvis. But overall, they were most likely doing both. They were most likely being bipedal, traveling bipedally when on the ground, but retaining some of those arboreal brachiating capabilities. Okay, so they were doing both, which when we think about it, that's extremely adaptive, right? Because if they're able to exploit food resources on the ground and in the trees, that only makes them more adaptable. They're able to exploit a wider variety of food sources. They're able to escape predators in creative ways. So, when you think about it, if the environment was mixed, then it made sense for them to do both. It made sense for them to be able to locomote in multiple different habitats. Do you have a question, Michaela, or is it an accidental hand raise? Okay. I'm not hearing anything, Michaela, so I'm going to move on, but maybe I'm not hearing it properly. Maybe if you could type it in the chat. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go on, but if you have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat and I will address it as soon as I can. All right, so cranial capacity, so basically the size of the brain. So I mentioned last class period that bipedalism predated expansion in cranial capacity by several million years. We know that the earliest bipeds were very small brained comparatively. So just for comparison, modern day humans have a cranial capacity somewhere between 1400 all the way up to 1700 cc's. And the Australopithecines anywhere from about 350 to about 550 cc's. So a modern day chimp, right around 350 to 400. So just slightly larger than modern day chimpanzees and bonobos. So we know that bipedal locomotion, the selective pressures for bipedalism, predated the selective pressures for a larger brain size by several million years. We're not going to really see a significant increase in brain size until we get to Homo erectus. Okay, so the two main groups we're going to talk about today, the gracile form. So I want you to think gracile, delicate, and the robust forms. I want you to think gracile, delicate, robust, large, strong, thick. So the gracile forms we're going to call genus Australopithecus, and the robust forms we're going to call genus Paranthropus. All right, questions so far? All right, let's delve into a very famous species, a very famous Australopithecine called Australopithecus afarensis. So that means southern ape from the Afar region. So like I mentioned last time, you guys are on mute, so I really encourage you. I'm going to say these names out loud a few times. I really encourage you to say these names out loud with me, because even though these names seem really long and scary and complicated right now, if you learn how to pronounce them, they become much more manageable, much easier to spell, much easier to talk about. So I encourage you to practice with me. So I'm going to say this name 3 times. This is Australopithecus afarensis. Second time, this is Australopithecus afarensis. Third time, this is Australopithecus afarensis. And one more time for good measure, this is Australopithecus afarensis. So geographically, fossils belonging to this species have been discovered in Eastern Africa, so mainly Tanzania and Ethiopia. And this particular fossil, there's more than one fossil that has been discovered that's attributed to this species, but the Lucy fossil is probably the most famous one. So that's why she's highlighted here. Lucy the skeleton is very complete considering how old it is. The Lucy skeleton itself is about 3.2 million years old, but the range for the species for afarensis is about 3 to probably about 3.6 million years ago. Okay, so Lucy's extremely complete for her age. About 40% of her skeleton was uncovered at the Hadar region by Dr. Donald Johansen. Date range for this species, anywhere from 3 to 3.6 million years old. She likely coexisted with many other species of Australopithecines. Her habitat would have been a mixture, woodland and grassland, but definitely by her time, we're starting to see the forest retreat and the grasslands expand. So even though the savanna hypothesis that we talked about last time may not be 100% correct, it is certainly possible that the expansion of the grasslands further selected for a commitment to bipedal locomotion, even though it may not have been the primary reason for it in the beginning, because we know that hominins were bipedal when still living in the forest. It may have encouraged a commitment to bipedal locomotion. So I think it's possible that there's more than one reason or more than one selective pressure that influenced bipedalism in hominids. It's possible that more than one of those hypotheses is at least partially correct. Okay, anatomical features. So I know sometimes it can feel like I'm listing when I get to this stuff, but I promise when we start to learn what these features are, it will be more and more useful for you to be able to classify the features, the anatomical features that go along with each group of species. So similar to Ardipithecus, we're going to see that the postcranial from the neck down, that anatomy is very mosaic. So that term mosaic just means mixture of, and when we're talking about fossils, we mean mixture of primitive and derived features. So mixture of older and newer features in evolutionary terms. Similar to Artie, Lucy was likely a habitual or part-time biped. So she was bipedal when traveling on the ground, however, retains some capacity for arboreal activity. So she was likely a biped and a brachiator. So she had features like longer arms, curved finger bones. She had a small non-honing canine. So remember, that's not like the gorilla. Let's pull out our gorilla. So not like our gorilla that has the massive projecting canines and the diastema. So remember, our gorilla has these really prominent canines on both the maxilla and the mandible. And they have the diastema, that's that space between the canine and that first premolar that allows the jaw to open and close like this. So they need that diastema to allow for the very large canines. Call a honing complex. So a gorilla does have a honing complex. One of the other defining characteristics of what it means to be human is that our ancestors, and us, of course, have non-honing canines. So some of our earliest ancestors will have slightly more pronounced, larger canines than we do, but certainly not nearly as large as what we see in our friend the gorilla. Okay, so this is an Australopithecine. This is a male Australopithecus afarensis. So Lucy's boyfriend, I guess. So you can see that the canine there is a bit larger than the other teeth, but you're not seeing that honing complex. You're not seeing any sort of massive space in between that canine and the first premolar. There's a little bit of a space, but nothing significant. So Lucy and her species have smaller, reduced canines that are non-honing. Lucy has a prognathic face. So this term prognathism When you turn the skull, so you look at it from a lateral view, so a lateral view just means a view from the side, the midface and the jaw are projecting forward. Okay, so we call that prognathism. In comparison, if you look at the profile of a modern human, oh, sorry guys, the delivery's here, so my dogs are going to bark for a second. Let's see if I can get them to stop. So we're just going to pause for a second when my dogs stop barking. Give you some extra time to write stuff down. So Lucy has a prognathic or projecting midface and jaw. We call that prognathism. Whereas modern humans will have a more flatter face, less prognathic. Okay, other feature that's actually not on this PowerPoint slide, but I want to point out. So when you flip the skull over and look at it from a superior angle, so this feature here, so these are the orbits. The orbits are just the eye sockets. The ridge of bone above the orbits, that's the supraorbital ridge. And then when you flip it all the way this way, see how it punches in there behind the brow? We're going to call that post-orbital constriction. So that's called post-orbital constriction. So in the earliest hominins that have a smaller brain size, especially of the frontal region, they're going to have a high degree or extreme degree of post-orbital constriction. And then if you're looking at, let's say, kind of a middle-aged, as far as the fossil record goes, a middle-aged hominin like Homo erectus, you're seeing, so Homo erectus has a cranial capacity probably about 800 to 1100 cc's. So not as large as ours, but starting to approach more modern day brain size. So you can see there's still a really, double arch projecting brow ridge here, but there's less constriction. There's still some constriction behind the brow ridge. It does pinch in a little bit, but it's not nearly as extreme. Okay, and then for comparison, everybody at home can do this. Start at your brow ridge and feel up to your hairline. You see that we have no constriction. Okay, we have the largest brain size of the hominins. Well, except the Neanderthals have a slightly larger, but that's beside the point. But we have the largest brain size if we're comparing it to the Australopithecines and Homo erectus. So we have no constriction behind the brow. Okay. Also, Lucy likely did not have articulate speech or language based on the anatomical structure of her hyoid bone. So remember, that's the U-shaped bone in the vocal tract. That's really important for reconstructing language capabilities, at least the physical ability to produce language. So based upon the anatomy of her hyoid bone, she likely did not have language. She likely vocalized like any other primate would, but she didn't likely have articulate speech in the way that we do. Cranial capacity, somewhere between 350 to 500 cc's, so barely bigger than what you see in a chimpanzee, and possibly a direct descendants of Australopithecus anamensis. All right, I know that's a lot of details, but I promise as we learn what these details are, it's going to start to make more sense. So this is just a repeat of what you just saw. There's nothing new here. It's just I like to give you guys these little summary slides to kind of help you summarize each species. So our species, let's say it together a few times again. Let's say it together 3 times. This is Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus afarensis. The nickname of the most famous fossil is Lucy. And the biological sex of this particular fossil is female, but they have uncovered multiple fossils that belong to this species or that are believed to belong to this species. The site is in Eastern Africa, a site called Hadar in Ethiopia, discovered by Dr. Donald Johanson back in the 1970s. And the famous story is that Dr. Donald Johanson and his colleagues were listening to the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds when they discovered her. So that's where she gets her name, Lucy. And we'll watch a clip here in a second that also talks about that. So her features, so again, this is a repeat of what you've already heard. She's a habitual biped or part-time biped. She would have been about 3.5 feet tall at adulthood. So the reason we think she's a habitual biped is her longer arms and curved finger bones, suggesting at least some degree of arboreal brachiation. Her small, non-honing canines. Her molars were a bit larger than what you would expect, likely because Australopithecus afarensis and other Australopithecines likely ate a highly vegetative, folivorous diet in comparison to us, and they likely did not use fire or tools to soften their food prior to consumption, and likely no language based on the hyoid bone. Okay, questions about Lucy? Okay, let's watch a little video clip on Lucy. And let me just, to make sure, I think I did, but I'm going to stop share for a second and reshare just to make sure I remember to optimize for sound. And I did. Look at me. Okay, let's get out of this PowerPoint for a second. And I want to show you this short little 4-minute clip that's going to talk about Australopithecus afarensis. So this is in your module. If any, these video clips are always in your module if you want to go back to them. So mainly I want you to sit back and relax and watch this, but I want you to also think about, while you're watching it, think about what anatomical features did they focus on? What about Lucy makes her a human or a hominid? What makes her a human ancestor, I should say? What makes Lucy a human ancestor? What parts of her skeleton did they focus on? And what do you think these anthropologists, these paleoanthropologists were thinking when they first discovered her? So just kind of think about that. You don't have to write it down unless you want to, but just kind of think about those questions and we'll talk about it after.
So we're in the airport in Addis, and we're about to board this little plane and fly over the Lucy site, home of Australopithecus afarensis, with Don Johansen, one of my childhood heroes, who has one of the original maps he used to work this place. I mean, how utterly cool is this? Hey, Don.
Here you are.
How you doing?
Great. Welcome aboard. You ready for this
I am. I can't
exciting adventure?
Excited is one word.
Look at those rocks.
That's
Boom, boom,
them.
boom, boom, boom. Just totally stretched out.
Yeah.
As a paleontologist, that is what I dream about.
Now see the volcanic ash cropping out? That's 3.4 million years old.
That is incredible.
One of our unique characteristics is walking on two legs. The question is, what did our ancient two-legged ancestors look like? A fossil found here in the Afar region of Ethiopia gives us a pretty good idea. Don's taking me to see where he found a 3.2 million year old hominid known as Lucy.
It was a Sunday morning back in 1974. So I came up here, looked at this, had no idea what was waiting. It was right in this area, right here. What I saw was a fragment of bone, and I looked at it and almost instantaneously said, that's a hominid.
Wow.
Once we broke that 3 million year barrier, it was a whole new picture of what our earliest ancestors looked like. One of the most exciting moments of my entire career.
Lucy made headlines around the world because although she looked a lot like an ape, she walked on two legs. She was a biped, and at that stage, the most ancient anyone had ever found.
Beautiful view of the camp.
Her bones are some of the best evidence we have for what early bipeds looked like.
Now, of course, if this were all articulated properly, you know, the vertebrae on top of one
You'd see
another,
it.
she'd be about 3.5 feet tall. You don't see that.
Yeah, you don't get that.
Here's the femur,
That's the left.
top end of the thigh bone.
And this one also, I mean, when you put it all together, now you have, you know, this is telling bipedal, this is
Right.
giving a hint of bipedal.
This certainly tells it was bipedal. That can't in like that, which is very characteristic. Our knees are close together and they
Yeah,
come
it's
up to the side. The chimps come straight up. So that's another very important aspect.
Having the upper and lower leg in a straight line is no good for a biped. It makes for an awkward, waddling gait. Lucy's legs formed an angle. Her knees were close together, just like our own knees. This positions the feet directly underneath the body, making walking easier and more efficient.
There we are.
Lucy walked much like us, but she wasn't human. she had many primitive features too.
Isn't it interesting? They had the pile of bones. You put her here, and all of a sudden you could see that it was a living person.
She's beautiful.
Yep. Thank you. We named her after the people and the land. We named her Australopithecus afarensis, from the Afar region.
So imagine if Lucy was here with us right now. What would she look like?
Well, she'd be short. She's only about 3.5 feet tall. And the one thing that would be familiar to us, that she would be walking upright. But with those long arms, reaching almost down to her knees, she'd probably have a very odd gait. And as she got closer, we'd see that she had a very ape-like face. I think in many ways she'd look like the ape that stood up.
Yeah, amazing.
You know?
Yeah.
Like the ape that stood up.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Lucy gives us a glimpse of a key moment in our evolutionary history. She tells us that by 3.2 million years ago, our ancestors had committed to walking on two legs.
All right, so who can tell me what parts of Lucy, what parts of her skeleton did they focus on when trying to determine whether she was more of a pongid, more of a quadrupedal ape, or more of a hominid, more of a bipedal ape like us? What parts of her body did they focus on? Her femur and hip structure. Excellent. Excellent, Janelle and Francisco. Excellent. Okay, so yeah, the femur is definitely an aspect of the skeleton that will help you determine biped versus quadruped. So the quadrupeds have the short, straight femur with a smaller neck, and the bipeds have the longer angled femur with a longer neck. Also the pelvis of a biped is shorter, broader, rounder, and more bowl-shaped, whereas the pelvis of a quadruped is longer and more narrow with the iliac blades flaring out to the side. Okay. Other features that we'll talk about later on, the shape of the spinal column, the position of the foramen magnum, and eventually the hallux or the big toe. Okay. So how do you think, any ideas how Dr. Donald Johanson and his colleagues would have felt when first discovering the Lucy fossil? What was going through their mind? And just to give you a little bit of a background, this is one of the first fossils that was discovered, one of the first human ancestors discovered. So it was a very big deal within the field of paleoanthropology, or at least one of the first fossils that was somewhat complete. There were some crania discovered before this, but this is one of the very most complete skeletons that was ever found, and the earliest complete one that was ever found. Okay, they would have thought it was a pretty big deal, right? They would have thought, wow, this is something that's not completely us, but it's also has a lot of aspects of us. It's basically a small-brained human, a small-brained hominin that's walking upright, that's possibly using tool technologies, that's possibly engaging in complex social interactions. So, of course, when we're looking at fossils that are, 3 million years old, we don't necessarily know how they behaved. But as we get closer and closer to us, we're going to see more and more evidence for things like control of fire, the production of complex tool technologies, even their social interactions. And we get to more recent ones, we can look at sometimes their social interactions. If we find groups of humans all together in one spot, we can sometimes look at possible symbolic and ritualistic burial practices. When we can start to look at DNA, we can look at how they were related to one another. If we find a group of hominin fossils, so we could maybe determine if they're still living together in families, or if they're practicing, if they're migrating or leaving their natal group, or if they're staying within their natal group. So lots of cool stuff. Lots of cool stuff to come. All right, questions so far? Anything about Lucy or anything in general? You're feeling good? Okay. All right, so let's talk about Australopithecus africanus. So we're still within the Gracile forms right now. These are still Gracile Australopithecines, but this is a new species. So let's say it together 3 times. This is Australopithecus africanus, Australopithecus africanus, Australopithecus africanus, and one more for good measure. This is Australopithecus africanus. So the nickname of this particular fossil is Mrs. Place. But interestingly enough, she was once thought to be a female member of Africanus, but it's now believed to be male, now that they've discovered more members of this species. And this one is slightly larger and more robust than the others. So this one is now believed to be a male member of Africanus. So she's considered to be, she or he, let's say, Africanus is considered to be a Gracile form, mainly because of features like slightly more rounded skull, less prognathic face. So when we're looking at prognathism, this is not Africanus, this is afarensis, but just to show you a similar species. So prognathism is talking about how far does the midface and the jaw project forward. So when you see that projection, you call that prognathism. If you see a flatter face, you call that lack of prognathism. She does not have any cranial crest, no sagittal or nuchal crest. We'll talk about that with the robust forms. And similar to Lucy, she has the small, non-honing canines. She was discovered, this species was discovered mainly in southern regions of Africa. So while Lucy was existing in the eastern regions, Africanus was existing in the southern. This particular fossil is dated to about 2.5 million years old. And the cranial capacity is about the same. The average for Africanus is about 485 cc's. Okay, so we're still not significantly larger than what we see in modern day chimpanzees and other apes. Okay, so let's say her together one more time. This is Australopithecus africanus. Australopithecus africanus. The Tong child is a child that's attributed to this species that we'll talk about when we watch the Dawn of Humanity film next week. Okay. All right, questions about Africanus. Okay, so we're still within the Gracile forms. This is Australopithecus sediba. Australopithecus sediba. One more time, Australopithecus sediba. So sediba means wellspring. So this particular fossil was discovered in the southern region of Africa by Dr. Lee Berger. Actually, his son, Matthew Berger, is actually who originally discovered this fossil. The date is very specific, you notice, because of the substrate it was found in. The Malapa cave is a limestone cave that allowed for extremely accurate dating. So they were able to be very specific in their dating of this fossil. This one's dated to about 1.97 million years old. Okay, so that would have been within the Middle Pleistocene period. So this is considered kind of a later Australopithecine, meaning closer to us. Actually, this one may have coexisted with members of our genus. Homo habilis, we see the earliest members of Homo habilis emerging in the fossil record about 2.5 million years ago. So they certainly existed at the same time, but the question really is, did they interact with one another? But this one is considered kind of a later form of the Australopithecine, so closer to us, closer to genus Homo. Some have debated whether sediba could be possibly that last direct common ancestor of our genus. However, it's debated since some members of the genus Homo predate this species. We see members of Homo habilis going back as far as 2.5 million years ago. Okay, so, and of course, it's very possible it's not just one species that led to genus Homo. Now that we're realizing that so many of these hominins likely interbred with one another, swapped their genes, and contributed to modern day gene pools, it's very possible that more than one species contributed to us. Okay, so anatomical features. So sorry, that's kind of listing again, but I promise this will start to make more sense once we learn what these features are. So overall brain size is still small. So right around 420 cc's is the average for this species. So small brain comparatively, small dentition, non-honing canines. So those are all features. The non-honing canines are features that you would expect in a hominin. But postcranially, so from the neck down, the postcranial skeleton is mosaic, still mosaic. So small body and long arms that allowed for arboreal climbing. However, a human-like hand and pelvis, a mosaic or mixed foot, mixed feature foot. So the smaller teeth, mandibles, and zygomatic arches. When comparing to other Australopithecines and zygomatic arches, we talked about it a little bit, but just to make sure we remember, the zygomatic arches, those are the cheekbones there. So when you look at it, this is Lucy, well, Lucy's boyfriend here, the male form of Lucy. So you see the cheekbones are extremely flaring. They flare out to the side. And the reason for that is they need to have room for their massive jaw muscles. So the jaw muscles will start here at the ramus, this part of the mandible, tuck underneath the zygomatic bones, and attach somewhere up here. Okay, so those flaring zygomatic bones, when you see that, that means a diet of rough, fibrous, tough food items. Okay, so most of the Australopithecines, especially the robust forms, we'll talk about either today or next time. The robust forms will have extreme flare to their zygomatic bones. But even some of the other Australopithecines that are not considered robust do definitely have more flare than you would see in a modern human. Everybody feel your own cheekbone for comparison. I know you can't necessarily flip it over and look at it like this, but everybody can feel their own cheekbone. And we can feel that, that it flares out a little bit, but not nearly as extreme as we see in this Australopithecine here. Okay, so some has suggested that because sediba, when you look here in the picture, because sediba has less flare and has smaller teeth and mandibles, they likely possibly controlled tools and had softer food to consume, because if they were using tools and maybe fire, we don't have evidence for that, but it's possible. If they were using these things to soften their food prior to consumption, it would have reduced the pressure on their jaw muscles, allowing for less zygomatic arch, smaller mandibles, smaller teeth, all that good stuff. So a lot of genus Homo type features is basically what we're saying here. So that's why some have suggested that sediba may have a place on the lineage that led to genus Homo. Okay, let's watch a little clip. We're going to watch most of Dawn of Humanity next week. But because this little clip here does talk about sediba, let's watch this little clip here. I'm sorry, I forgot to pull this one up ahead of time. Let's go here. Okay, we're starting at 28. Okay, so as you're watching this clip, I want you to mainly focus on same thing that you did with Lucy. Focus on what parts of the skeleton are the paleoanthropologists focusing on. What are they really looking at to determine what they can deduce about the species? What parts of the skeleton are they looking at? What conclusions are they making? And I believe this clip also kind of goes into how they reconstruct these artistic recreations of what these hominins would have looked like. So there's a paleo artist by the name of Victor Dieck, and he is really good at this. He is really good at, he has a deep understanding of tissue depth and how tissue attaches to bone. So if he can study the bone, if he can study the cranial features, the facial features, the postcranial features, he can reconstruct what that hominin may have looked like. Okay, so let's watch this little clip and then we'll talk about it. You guys have any questions before I play the clip? Feeling good? Okay.
Made it unlike any found before. Many types of Australopithecus once walked the earth between about 2 and 4 million years ago. Lucy is known as afarensis. There's also Australopithecus africanus. This appeared to be an entirely new species. Lee called it Australopithecus sediba, after the waterhole near which it was found. In the local language Sutu, sediba means wellspring. The team was able to radioactively date the limestone layers in the cave with great precision. The layer containing the sediba skeletons was 1.97 million years old. That makes these creatures among the last of their kind, living right at the end of the fossil gap between Australopiths and Homo erectus. Here at last was a creature that could tell us something about that transition. And the bones were not just fragments. Here were two remarkably complete skeletons, a female and a child. Still encased in the rock at Malapa are fragments of at least 3 more, waiting to be excavated. This made sediba the most complete evidence ever found for what was going on at the dawn of humanity.
The Australopithecus sediba fossils are some of the most spectacular skeletons known for early hominids. They're absolutely amazing. We don't get 2 bones associated with one another very often, much less several bones, much less partial skeletons. So that makes these fossils really special.
Sediba was exciting from the get-go. Right away, we knew that we had parts of the skeleton and we had parts of the cranium, which helps us figure out who this animal is. So that was really, really exciting. And initially, these upper limb bones looked very primitive. So we knew that we were dealing with something that looked like it would be a good climber, kind of an ape-like creature.
Peter Schmidt's job is to reconstruct sediba's skeleton. Unlike past fossil finds, here, the skeletons are so complete, there doesn't have to be much guesswork. By scanning and mirror imaging, Peter can fill in any missing bones with great accuracy.
From the CT, we got a few thousand slices now. And Aurora has to put everything together to form a 3D model. And then we have to cut the model because the pelvis we already casted. So we only need the rib cage. But the right rib cage we have already, but we need now the mirror image of that. And the computer helps us to do the mirror image in a second.
Layer by layer, a 3D printer then slowly prints the rib cage in fine plaster.
Ah, beautiful.
Finally, Peter has assembled a complete skeleton. It's highly unusual. All Australopiths are a mix of ape and human, but sediba has a unique mosaic of features scientists have never seen before in the same creature.
The arm is very long, like in a chimpanzee, but the hand is with short fingers and a very long thumb, like a human hand, which was never found until now, because this is the most complete hand ever found in this period.
Job Keeby, who was with Lee and Matthew when they discovered the skeletons, has been working on the sediba hand. He's found an unusual combination of ape and human features here, too.
What's special about sediba's arm and hand is that we know sediba has a very long arm, which is more chimp-like. But sediba has a very human-like hand. For example, sediba has a thumb which is longer relative to the other fingers, which indicates a human-like condition.
Sediba's hand, with its opposable thumb and forefingers, is so human that it could have been a tool user. But since no tools were found, that remains only an intriguing possibility. From the reconstructed skeleton, paleoartist Victor Dieck can start to create a lifelike digital painting. By virtually applying tissue thickness markers carefully calculated from the known facial tissues of living primates, he can build up a realistic impression of Sediba's face.
Once that was all done, I have now gone ahead and created a body for it. And if you want to see, we can check all that by going transparent and making sure that the bones and everything line up in the proper spaces. So here we have a concept reconstruction of how Sediba potentially could look like.
The step from there to a lifelike digital painting is a short one. Finally, for the first time in almost 2 million years, the face of Australopithecus sediba looks out on the world once again. But the true revelations will come from the bones themselves. Because they are so well preserved, these fossils will give scientists unprecedented insights into the lives of these ancient creatures. Everything from what they ate to how they died. Such details might help explain the Australopith's transition into our genus, Homo. They might also prove or disprove a highly influential theory about the dawn of humanity. A theory inspired by the very first discovery of an Australopith fossil. The year.
All right, we're going to go ahead and pause there. We will finish that documentary next week, or possibly the week after, because next week is Thanksgiving. But we will get to it, I promise. But I wanted to show that little piece because I really like how they show you how they use 3D imaging and knowledge of tissue depth markers in modern day primates to recreate these artistic images that you see. So even though, yes, there's some degree of hypothesis work here that, you know, we're guessing whether or not they had hair, because how much hair, because obviously hair doesn't preserve in the fossil record. We're hypothesizing about what their skin tone would have been, because obviously that doesn't preserve in the fossil record. But things like their posture and the length of their arms, the length of their legs, their cranial features, those are all pretty scientific because we have the bones in those cases. We have the bones and we have knowledge of tissue depth and how ligaments and muscles attach to bones. So even though there's a little bit of guesswork there, I wanted to kind of show that clip because a lot of what you see is pretty scientifically reproduced. Okay, questions about that? We're feeling pretty good. Okay, let's do just a little bit more because I want to show you a little bit of the more robust forms. Okay, so we're transitioning. We have one more this one's kind of questionable. Actually, this one's kind of in between Gracile and robust. This is Australopithecus gari. Let's say that one together a few times. This is Australopithecus gari. Second time, Australopithecus gari. Third time, Australopithecus gari. And one more time for good measure, Australopithecus gari. So this is another Eastern African species. So Ethiopia is the site where most of this fossil was found. All of this fossil was found. So the date for this fossil, about 2.5 million years old. The habitat would have been a woodland environment. Sorry, guys, the dogs are going at it again. But mixed woodland environment. And if you notice, this species was coexisting at the same time as Africanus. Africanus was more southern Africa. Gari was likely more eastern Africa. But of course, it's very likely that these species may have somehow interacted. Because of course, one of the coolest things, in my opinion, one of the coolest things about this field is we haven't uncovered all the fossils yet. So It's not to say that we won't eventually find that Gari made it further south, or that sediba and africanus made it further north and east. So we know anatomically speaking, so one of the reasons we consider it more robust, really large molars and premolars, so those are the teeth in the back of our mouth. So likely had a diet that required quite a bit of crushing and grinding. So mainly fibrous vegetation, underground tubers, things like that. Prognathic ape-like jaw. So remember, prognathism just refers to how far does the jaw and the midface project forward. So when you're looking at it from the side, how far do the midface and jaw project forward? This one is also proposed to be one of the possible direct ancestors of genus Homo. And the reason for that is they have a more human-like humerus to femur ratio. So that may seem like a minor detail, but when we're talking locomotion, so thinking back to what we learned way back in the primate locomotion section, the humerus to femur ratio is critical in determining how that species would have moved about. What was their primary mode of locomotion? So what we're seeing is long angled femurs that are longer and have that bicondylar angle, and a much shorter humerus. So the humerus, that's the bone right here. The femur is the bone in our thigh, okay? So their humerus to femur ratio is much more like you would see in modern day Homo sapiens. So that's indicating a more sophisticated or more advanced version of bipedalism than we see in some of the other Australopithecines. So still overall considered habitual, but maybe kind of inching into that more obligate bipedalism. Cranial capacity, still nothing major, about 450 cc's on average. The other reason why they're considered to be possibly on the lineage that leads directly to genus Homo, they were possibly the first user and maker of stone tool technology, because the Australopithecus gari remains were found in association with some antelope bones that have cut marks on them that indicate that they had kind of broken open the bone to expose the marrow, which is typical of what you see in scavenging species. So this is an interesting find because of its age and its physical characteristics. So this is like sediba, one of the two species that has been proposed to be the most recent or direct ancestor of genus Homo. All right, so let's talk about the robust forms. So we're kind of transitioning our talk from the Gracile forms out to the robust forms. So we're still talking Australopithecines. Some paleoanthropologists don't separate them. Some paleoanthropologists call them all Australopithecines, and some are Gracile, some are robust. Some paleoanthropologists think that these species are different enough that it warrants their own genus. So not only their own species, but their own genus. So just to review, like us, we're Homo sapiens. So our genus name is Homo, our species name is Sapiens. For these guys and gals, their genus name is Paranthropus. And we'll talk about a few specific species for examples. But in general, the common physical characteristics that you're going to see, smaller front teeth and large molars and premolars. So small incisors and canines, large premolars and molars. Cranial capacity, about the same as what you see in the Gracile forms, maybe a little bit bigger, but nothing significant. So anywhere from about 410 to 510 cc's. They do have that bony mohawk feature, the sagittal crest. So remember the sagittal crest, that's that bony mohawk that runs down the center of the skull that serves as the attachment point for the jaw muscles. Okay, so for the gorilla, the jaw muscles start all the way down here at the ramus. They tuck underneath the zygomatic bones, and then they attach all the way up here at the sagittal crest. So whenever you see that sagittal crest, whenever you see flaring zygomatic bones, massive premolars and molars, you know that species consumed a diet of harder, rougher, tougher food items. Okay, so things like vegetation, underground tubers, possibly some degree of nuts, but basically just hard food items that they were not likely softening with food prior to, or softening with fire prior to consumption. This group of species is considered to be an evolutionary dead end, just meaning that they did not leave any modern day descendants. They're an evolutionary dead end, simply because the biggest hypothesis out there is because their diet was too specialized. These hominins were focusing in on tough fibrous vegetation and underground tubers, and they really weren't consuming a whole lot of other things. So that meant that once the environment shifted, They were too specialized. You know, what do I always say? In the game of evolution, diversity wins. So the Gracile forms and genus Homo simply had a wider, more varied diet. So they were more adaptable. So like I mentioned, some paleoanthropologists give them their own genus. We're going to call that Paranthropus, while others include them with the genus Australopithecus and just call them robust forms. I tend to think, not that my opinion matters, but I tend to think that they are different enough to warrant their own genus, because they are very different in many ways. They have that, you know, extremely prognathic face, extreme flare to their zygomatic bones, the sagittal crest and nuchal crest. I tend to think that they are different enough to warrant their own genus, but just so you know, depending on who you're talking to, if you hear the term robust Australopithecine, just know that they're talking about Paranthropus. Okay, so let's show you a couple examples of species that we attribute to Paranthropus. So this is the black skull. The date for this one is about 2.5 million years old in Eastern Africa at a site called Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. Discovered by Walker, Leakey, Harris, and Brown, and published in Nature in 1986. So the features that we're going to see, an extremely prognathic face. So I know this is more of a front angle you're seeing here. Remember, prognathism just talks about the midface and the jaw. When you're looking at it from a lateral or a view from the side, you can see that that face has a high degree of prognathism. The large, pronounced sagittal crest, that bony mohawk running down the center, massive jaws. I know the mandibles aren't in this image, but the mandibles associated with the species are very large in comparison. Small canines and massive premolars and molars. So all those features that kind of go along with those robust forms. Cranial capacity about 410 cc's, so still within the range of what we see with other Australopithecines. All right, this one here is probably the most famous fossil attributed to the robust forms, or Paranthropus. So let's say this one together a few times. This is Paranthropus boisei. Second time, this is Paranthropus boisei. Third time, Paranthropus boisei. And one more time for good measure, Paranthropus boisei. The nickname given to this fossil was Nutcracker Man, because when this fossil was first uncovered by the Leakeys, Mary and Lewis Leakey, in the 1960s, they thought that this has to be a species that this has a very specialized diet. It's likely eating extremely hard food items. So they thought, well, maybe they're eating mainly nuts. Maybe they're using their teeth to crack open these nutshells. But further analysis and further understanding of how jaw muscles are affected by diet and how the craniofacial shape is affected by diet. I mean, we see really robust features in our friend the gorilla, and we know that the gorilla eats mainly vegetation, which when you think about it, if you're eating vegetation, that does require a lot of chewing force, especially if you're supporting a large body size. You have to eat a lot of salad to support a 450 pound body size. Okay, so they also have this really characteristic wide concave face. So that's this region here, wide concave face, really enormous molars. Their molars are 4 times the size of our molars. So really massive molars, massive large jaws. They have a zygomatic flare or zygomatic arch. So that's just referring to the cheekbones. So obviously this isn't Paranthropus, but it's an example of zygomatic flare. So it's when you're looking at it from this angle, how far do the cheekbones flare out to the side? Of course, the sagittal crest, and a very specialized diet, emphasized tough vegetation such as sedges and grasses. So they sometimes call those C4 plants, and not likely a whole lot of nuts, even though that's where boisei got its nickname, is the Nutcracker Man. But from further study, we know that they likely just ate high percentage of rough, tough, fibrous vegetation. Cranial capacity, probably one of the bigger ones we've seen so far, but still not significant. We're still in that, not higher than 550 range. The average for the species is probably about 530 cc's. So still just within that range of what we see with the other Australopithecines. All right. Okay, this is a new one. This is Australopithecus didromita. Let's say that one together a few times. This is Australopithecus didromita. Second time, Australopithecus didromita. And last time, Australopithecus didromita. So this name means close relative in the Afar language. The date range for this species, this is an older Australopithecine, meaning more deep in evolutionary time. So date range is about 3.5 to 3.3 million years old. So it would have coexisted with Lucy species and likely others, but that's definitely within the same time range as the Lucy species. Found in Eastern Africa, in Ethiopia, discovered by Johannes Haile Selassie. The features, small anterior dentition. So remember, anterior is just in the front. So the incisors and canines are significantly smaller than the molars and the premolars. So that's, we only have a mandible and a little bit of a maxilla so far for this species. So we don't have a whole lot of information, but we do know based upon the robusticity of the jaw, of the mandible, and the largeness, the massiveness of the molars and premolars in comparison to the incisors and canines, and also the date range, that we're most likely looking at a robust Australopithecine. Based on what we already know about other fossil species, if we had to make an educated hypothesis, we're most likely looking at a robust Australopithecine. So cranial capacity, of course, is unknown because only the mandible and part of the maxilla was uncovered, but likely in the range of other Australopiths. So if we had to, again, make an educated hypothesis, the brain size is probably about what you see in other Australopithecines. Okay, so last slide for today, I promise. Just a little bit of a window into what we're going to talk about next week and the week after, and probably the week after that, is our genus Homo. So the big changes that you're going to see as we're transitioning from Australopithecine to early members of genus Homo, we are going to see a slight jump, a slight increase in cranial capacity. So the Australopithecines, most of them are anywhere from 350 to 500 cc's. Early genus Homo, so like Homo habilis and Rudolfensis, we're not going to see a huge jump, so right around 500 to 600 cc's. But once we get to Homo erectus, once we get to that species, we will see for the first time a huge jump in cranial capacity. So Homo erectus had a cranial capacity between about 800 to 1,000 cc's. We're also going to see changes in diet, which led to changes in craniofacial shape, and likely more use of tools and possible control of fire. So the reason I bring that up now is when you think about it, cooking our food prior to consumption does play a big role in the composition of our food, the texture of our food. Eating a cooked potato is far easier than eating a raw potato. So as we cooked our food and controlled fire, that changed the selective pressure for large jaw muscles and massive molars and flaring zygomatic bones and sagittal crests, all that good stuff. So as we see the transition into genus Homo, we see more rounded globular cranial shape. We see smaller jaws, smaller mandibles and zygomatic arches, decreasing postorbital constriction. So remember, that's that feature when we hold the skull like this. So these are the supraorbital ridges, the brow ridges. Postorbital constriction just refers to how far does it pinch in behind the brow ridge. So we see a pretty extreme degree in this one because this is an Australopithecine. But when we get to genus Homo, we're going to see a reduction or a reduced amount of constriction. So here's our brow ridges here. There's our supraorbital ridges. And you see there's still some constriction there, but it's not nearly as extreme. It's a reduced or slighter degree of constriction. All right, and we also see a reduction in dentition, okay, especially of the posterior dentition, the teeth in the back of our mouth, our premolars and molars. So we know that early members of genus Homo had a more generalized dentition, meaning that there's not a significant difference between the size of the incisors and canines in comparison to premolars and molars. There's not a significant difference. So they were likely eating a more generalized diet, a more omnivorous diet. So they were still eating vegetation and tubers and fruit and insects, but likely, especially once we get to Homo erectus and onward, they were likely consuming more meat in their diet. So they're still not carnivores. No primates are carnivores. We all eat at most an omnivorous diet. Especially humans and chimpanzees are categorized as omnivorous. Most other primates are not. Most other primates are either frugivores or folivivores. It's really just us, humans and our ancestors and chimpanzees that are more omnivorous. So early genus Homo has more generalized dentition, and we're also going to see an increased access or increased evidence for access to tools, production of tools, use of tools. And also later, we're going to see evidence for the control of fire that would allow us to process and soften our food prior to consumption. So that's why fire is oftentimes talked about when we speak about human evolution. I mean, of course, there's other benefits. The control of fire also allows us to stay warm as we start migrating into regions that are cooler than Africa. It allows us to possibly protect ourselves as other predators may be trying to eat us. We can use fire to protect ourselves. We can use fire to light the way if we're going through a cave or if we're trying to do something in the nighttime. Fire obviously provides us with light and protection. And it has social benefits. It allows us to stay up around a fire pit and talk to each other after the sun goes down. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information all jumbled into one right there. But I did want to kind of finish up that lecture today. Let me go ahead and pause our recording here.